Hello and welcome to F15, our new digital TV channel. My name is Sophie Spiegelberger, editorial team at Forbes DACH, the German edition of Forbes magazine. Today I will be talking to Stephanie Liechtenstein, diplomatic correspondent, about what a Trump presidency meant for diplomacy in the past 4 years and what a Joe Biden presidency will mean for diplomacy going forward. Welcome, Stephanie.
Thanks for having me.
So 2 weeks ago, the US held its latest presidential election, where Joe Biden was declared the winner of the election about 5 days after Election Day. In terms of diplomacy and the US's role in the world global order, what did 4 years of a Trump administration mean for institutions like the OSCE and the IEA and the European Union in general?
So I think one of the general things one can say about the Trump administration and its foreign policy in the past 4 years, is that basically you could see less appreciation of multilateralism, of multilateralist institutions, and a much stronger focus on basically the national interest in the US. So some of these institutions, I think, suffered from the fact that the US was not as much engaged as it was before the Trump administration. That's a more general comment, I would say.
Were there also, you're saying some of these institutions suffered from the US withdrawing and taking a sort of backside role, not being as present, but were there potential upsides? Because the US is often criticized for putting its fingers in everyone else's pots and mingling in areas where they maybe shouldn't.
Yes, I know what you're referring to, but in general, I don't really see any upsides, to be honest, because what I did observe in the past few years is that the US behavior also emboldened some other states to do the same. It kind of almost motivated them to do the same because it became more acceptable in international affairs to behave in a more nationalistic way. So you could then also observe some of this behavior, I think, from states which, before would always favor multilateral solutions. So I think I personally don't really see any positive impact, to be honest.
Like what countries would those maybe be? Are you referring to maybe Russia or?
No, I was referring more to other countries that, in the past would always be extremely supportive of multilateral institutions. They still are, but there's now a bit of a tendency that other states do the same. I could observe some of this personally within the context of the OSCE, where a handful of states basically weakened the institution by not agreeing to prolonging the 4 most important leadership positions. So I think, to a certain degree, some of this can be traced back also to the US role on the international stage in general. I think the US did not participate in the problems related to the OSCE leadership package, but in general, there's a trend of the US being less supportive of multilateral solutions. And I think that has an impact on other states' behavior, which is why I think this is not a very good development in general.
So to a certain extent, the US was leading by example, but in a good way. And their leadership was welcome and needed, sort of, according to, what do you think?
No, what I was saying is the US example of not supporting multilateral institutions as much as it did before the Trump administration came into office, was setting a bad example for other states who then kind of took on this behavior and almost replicated the behavior and did the same. So I think, some of these states, European states, who previously would always favor multilateral institutions, have now begun to also turn their back to multilateralism sometimes. And at least I personally have never observed that before. It kind of became more acceptable. I think that's what I'm trying to say. It became more acceptable for other states to also favor just purely their national interest. I think it's a general trend in international relations that can be observed, particularly during the past 4 years, where there is less appreciation of common solutions and of win-win situations, if you like, and much more of a focus on this zero-sum thinking. Basically, it's always the thinking that someone is a winner and the other one is a loser, and there's less of a strategic thinking about common solutions. I think that's a general trend, and my feeling is that some of this was triggered, but then also empowered and strengthened by some of the US behavior.
So do you think that was the EU prepared for this abdication of leadership, for the US to withdraw and to become more protectionist before Trump was elected? Did anyone expect him to be elected within these organizations, and were they preparing for this scenario in any way?
My feeling, and also the year 2016, in terms of what I can still remember from that year, my feeling was that no one in Europe really expected Trump to win. And there was a lot of focus in Europe on other problems, like, for example, the migration crises, or even Brexit, that the referendum happened also in 2016, if you remember. So there was a lot of focus in Europe on its own problems, and I don't really think anyone expected Trump to win. I remember myself having a conversation with a European official at the time, and it seems most people at the time thought that the Trump campaign was just a campaign, and he would never gain the support of so many American voters. So I think it came as a surprise.
Yeah, it came as a surprise to many of us as well, people who voted and people in the United States. But is there any way in which, how did the EU then end up coping with the fact that he was president? Now looking back, we've had 4 years of the Trump administration. Can we say the EU handled the situation well or not?
I think once Trump came into office, there was still a bit of hope in Europe that maybe he would adapt to the office. He would become a responsible president, and some of the things he said during his campaign were maybe just meant as a way to win the presidency, but that he would adapt once he's in office. But I think it became clear quite very quickly, actually, from the beginning of his presidency, that those were his true colors. Everything he said and promised during his campaign was something he was going to deliver during his presidency. So I think, after all, if you're looking back during the past 4 years, in the end, while there were lots of controversies and even insults and problems created in Washington, in the end, I think that the transatlantic bond showed its resilience, because it is still there. The relations between Europe and the US are so strong And my feeling is they could not, or they cannot really be torn apart or damaged so much, even by 4 years of a Trump presidency. I think after all, Europe coped well, and you can see the resilience of the transatlantic bond, really. That's my impression.
So then that means that this alliance is strong enough that it can deal with 4 years of Trump. Did anything happen in these 4 years that is irreversible, say when it comes to the Iran nuclear deal, where Iran now has a lot more enriched uranium than it did and is probably less willing to go back to the Obama era Iran nuclear deal, even though Biden says he would want to join again? Maybe that ship has sailed. So are there any other areas in which irreversible things have happened, in which we cannot just go back to the pre-Trump diplomatic relations as they were?
I think one important thing to keep in mind is that the world has become incredibly complex. And one of the things you could see as a general trend, not only in the past 4 years, but also during the past 4 years, is, for example, the rise of China. And to me, to a certain degree, the withdrawal from the international stage by the Trump administration created a vacuum, which then China filled to a certain degree. So I'm not sure to what degree that can be reversed. I don't think it can, to be honest. It's a fact that China is now a major player on the international stage, and it is something, in my view, that Washington and Europe, Brussels will have to cope, will have to deal with together. It's one of the main challenges that they will have to look at together, but as such, the development cannot be reversed. When it comes to the Iran nuclear deal, it's complicated. I agree, it's not so easy. Even if I think Biden and most of the Obama era officials would all argue that the Iran nuclear deal was one of the biggest successes of international diplomacy. I think it's not so easy to just go back into the deal because, as you just said, Iran has violated the deal and is now increasing its stockpile of uranium, is enriching its uranium, which makes it very difficult for Biden politically to simply rejoin the accord if Iran is violating the accord. So one of the preconditions would have to be for Iran to get back into compliance. But the question is, how do you make Iran go back into compliance? And I'm guessing various experts will give you different ways how to achieve that, but it's certainly not going to be easy. But I still expect very big attempts and efforts by the Biden administration to find a way to get back into an international agreement together with Europe.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that these European institutions are counting on Biden coming back and being as strong a global diplomatic force as Obama, especially considering all of the crises that are in the United States, such as the COVID crisis, which Biden will probably spend most of his time dealing with, the economic crisis, maybe for the first year of his presidency or even more, he won't be paying much attention to diplomacy and foreign affairs. Do you think everyone is ready for that, or do people expect him to come back with as much time and put as much effort into it as Obama?
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think Europe will have to be patient to a certain degree because, as you just mentioned, there are so many challenges domestically in the US that Biden will have to address, from the pandemic to the economic situation, but also to the overcoming the divide in the country, which really is quite scary if you think about it. So Biden will have to invest a lot of work and efforts into healing the country first. And as you say, my impression is also that this will be a major focus of his administration in the very first months of his administration. Mm-hmm. So I think while many in Europe were breathing this sigh of relief and feeling some hope that there will now be a stronger cooperation again with Washington, I think there will definitely have to be some patience. Mm-hmm. But I do expect then the Biden administration to also make some of the promises that they have already mentioned now that they will be looking at, such as, for example, the Iran nuclear deal, but also looking at other international agreements and arms control agreements that the Trump administration withdrew from. Mm-hmm. So I think it will come with time.
Mm. As you mentioned, sort of a vacuum came to be, which was then filled by China in the lacking U.S. leadership and presence on the global stage, which leads us to EU and its use of soft power. So the EU must rely a lot on soft power, especially with the US having lowered their contributions to NATO and sort of cutting that. Is the EU looking to become more self-sufficient, or does it plan to continue to rely on the US, especially militarily when it comes to dealing with conflicts with maybe bigger other players like Russia and China?
Right. So I think it's a very simple fact that Europe depends on the US. I think Europe is very much aware of this. And even during the Trump administration, as I mentioned before, this strong transatlantic bond remained in place, and it's still there. And I think it's a simple fact that the US military strength, but also its nuclear umbrella, whether you like nuclear weapons or not, the fact that it's there is a protection for Europe. So I think that's a simple fact. But I think that shouldn't stop Europe from engaging in more power sharing, because I think it was already back in 2014 that NATO members agreed to spend at least 2% of their GDP on defense. And many of the NATO members haven't met that target. Mm-hmm. So I think it's only fair that Europe invests more in burden sharing. But I think the focus should really be on the sharing, on the burden sharing. And I'm guessing that the Biden administration will definitely ask for Europeans to do some burden sharing, but in a spirit of partnership, in a spirit of the alliance, and not necessarily exchanging insults or even questioning the alliance. I think this was really one of the biggest problems in the Trump administration, that NATO was questioned. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's really that Europe has to engage in more burden sharing and partnership with the US.
You're frozen, but I could still hear you. Let's see. Okay, now you're not frozen.
Is this okay?
Yeah. Now you're not frozen again, so okay, I can cut that.
So maybe it was something with the internet connection, I don't know.
Okay, and then I'll cut that up. And then next question. So when it comes to the Paris Climate Accord and fighting climate change, was it unexpected when the Trump administration decided to leave? What were the how did the EU plan on dealing with that, and how will it help when the US rejoins, hopefully?
So I think it's one of the first things I am expecting the Biden administration, once it comes into office. One of the first things, apart from dealing with domestic problems, one of the first things will be to rejoin the Paris Climate Accord. I think Biden has said that on numerous occasions, that this is one of his most important goals, is to work on climate change with a global effort. So when he says if it's a global effort, I'm guessing it must involve some form of a multilateral agreement. So I'm assuming there will be steps taken and efforts made that the US assumes some form of leadership again when it comes to climate change, and also listening to the scientists and simply believing in the scientific fact of climate change. And I think when Trump withdrew from the Paris Climate Accord, after all, after his years and months in office, in the end, it was expected in Europe that this would happen at a certain stage. But nevertheless, most Europeans, I think, in public, but also in the governments, were quite shocked and also saddened by this step, because it took many years to negotiate this agreement, and it was an enormous diplomatic effort, similar to the JCPOA, to the Iran nuclear deal. These type of multilateral agreements don't just come into place or into force just like that. It takes an enormous effort and many years. So I think it was really quite saddening and shocking to many in Europe, but also elsewhere in the world, when the Trump administration decided to withdraw. Because precisely from such powerful countries, there's leadership is needed to get other countries on board and to get them engaged in this global effort.
Yeah, let's hope that works out. And lastly, let's turn to the election itself. So as we know, Donald J. Trump has still not formally conceded and acknowledged that Joe Biden has won the Electoral College. And what kind of message does that send to other countries around the world, countries where the results of elections are often disputed or are possibly really actually rigged, and there is real distrust in the election system? What kind of message does that send when the US itself is now questioning the results of their own election?
Well, I mean, first of all, while sending a negative example abroad and in the world in general, I think it also sends a really bad signal to the American population. It's kind of undermining the democratic process and the trust in democratic institutions and in the election process, which is one of the most important things in a liberal democracy, is that citizens have trust that their vote is counted and that they have a say during an election. And that the election process is free and fair. So I think if someone of this, if an American president questions the American elections and the fact and questions whether they have been free and fair, sends a really bad signal to the American population. And it also furthers the divide in the country and makes it much more difficult for a new president to then heal the country and also bring on board all the other 73 or I don't know how many million people voted, 73 million, voted for Trump, to actually bring them on board. So that's one part. And the other part, as you said, is the signal that it sends to, for example, populist or autocratic leaders in the world, because it emboldens them. It basically helps their legitimacy to a certain degree. So I think it's a negative development in two different ways.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today.